G'day. Welcome to the AgriCoach podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the Financial Bloke. You've probably noticed that we've had a bit of a change on the podcast from the Financial Bloke podcast to the AgriCoach podcast, brought to you by the Financial Bloke. It's the exact same host, me, the exact same content, and the exact same objective. It's just a simple name change, nothing more. So now that we've sorted that out, let's get cracking. Today, we've got a real treat. We're going to deep dive into the heart of family dynamics and business with a super special guest. But before we meet our guest, I want to talk you through something. How many times have you seen this? A seemingly minor argument within a family business doesn't get resolved, and over time it compounds, it builds up, and ends up in a full-blown dust-up or a Mexican standoff. It's a scenario that all parents fear, a breakdown in communication and trust that threatens not only the business, but the very fabric of family relationships. It happens way more than you think, and often with catastrophic consequences. It often, but not always, looks like this. Dad becomes that stubborn old coot. Mum might become silent and sullen, or son or son-in-law becomes an angry, frustrated man, and the daughter-in-law, well, often she just gets labelled as that devil trying to destroy the family. Now, this is not always the story we hear, but it's always similar in some way, shape or form. And here's the truth of it. If you're in a business with family, you're bound to face tough conversations and you'll need to have disagreements. And let's face it, avoiding these discussions only amplifies the conflicts lurking beneath the surface. It is healthy to have difficult conversations, but you need the right mindset, the right emotions, and the right skills to turn them into growth for the family rather than the seeds of destruction. The question is, does it have to be that way? A Mexican standoff or an absolute dust-up? And the answer is no. And that's where professional mediators like our guest today come in. They're experts who navigate the stormy waters of family disputes, helping to mend bridges and find common ground where it seems impossible. If your family or a family you know feels like they've hit the point of no return and feel like things are hopeless or have gone too far to be ever repaired, well, today is going to be right up your alley. Our guest is Kate Clark, a former lawyer turned mediation expert. She's the managing director of Clark & Associates Mediation Services, a firm specialising in family dispute resolution, child-inclusive mediation, and commercial and property settlement mediation. Kate's going to explain what mediation is, how it can help families in crisis, and delve into strategies to help you nip conflict in the bud before it turns into a full-blown dust-up. Kate's not just an expert in a field, she's also a passionate advocate for families. So whether you're considering mediation or simply seeking better communication strategies for your family, you're in the right place. So without further delay, welcome Kate.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Now, Kate, you're a mediator and also a lawyer by trade, which we won't hold that against you.
Yeah, I'm one of the good ones.
One of the good ones, yeah. The rare ones. Hey?
Yeah,
awesome.
They hide us in secret spots, Ben.
Yeah, okay. So why do families seem to find it so hard to have difficult conversations?
Good question. I think there are so many different reasons. I think for some people, they don't feel psychologically safe to have really tricky conversations with family. Other people don't have the skill set to have difficult conversations. I think that some people feel very vulnerable when conflict is around or very uncomfortable and they try and avoid it. And other people seem to have this philosophy that if we just pretend that conflict isn't there, it'll go away and we don't have to address it. But the reality of that is it sort of creates this atmosphere of artificiality that everything's going okay when in reality it might not be. I think the other thing about conflict is most people are quite insightful and they realise that conflict is their own interpretation of situations, and sometimes they wonder whether they're the problem or they're being too sensitive or their issues might not be as relevant or as important as they think that they are in the moment. And so they sort of just avoid having these deeper conversations because they're not so sure about their own thoughts or their own values. Yeah, I think those are some of the reasons. And I certainly see those types of reasons becoming fairly evident when I talk with people in the pre-mediation steps before mediation.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I see in a lot of families is they're just not taught the skills to be able to have conversations and have disagreements or arguments, shall we say, or conflict from very small things. And then so when the larger ones come up, they just way out of their depth. So they either avoid the conversations or they just blow up because they don't actually know how to deal with it. And I think as a generation almost, we've been taught not to have that conflict. Conflict's bad. I know I was taught that in my family. You just repress it and repress it and repress it until eventually it comes out with a chainsaw or an axe and just destroys everything.
I think there is a generational explanation too, right? You know, if we look at how our parents have difficult conversations or how they've been taught to deal with difficult circumstances, there are so many changes in those wider values, you know, outside of conflict resolution. You know, the stiff upper lip sort of, you know, mentality of the generation that our grandparents grew up in, that you just get on with things because there were bigger issues back in the time that they were kids. You know, I think back to when my grandparents were little, they weren't worried about conflict resolution. They were worried about survival. So, you know, there's this mentality sometimes that being emotional is a negative thing. But as we sort of change as a society, I think we're getting better at emotional intelligence and also conflict resolution and resilience. But as you say, it's a skill that we're all still learning. And I think there are some generational and some value differences between people.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think also from looking back through the generations in my family, it's also a respect thing. You know, you don't argue with your parents or your grandparents. That's a disrespectful. You respect your elders. And so when it comes to having those conflicts, as you grow up, you start to really find it difficult. And I find that in a lot of rural production family businesses is there's a strong element of you respect your elders. And so I can't have a tough conversation with mum or dad or especially grandparents because then, you know, that'll be violating one of our major family values.
Yeah. It's so interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking about my grandfather who was Polish and, you know, had left Poland as a young man to be in the war and then was captured by Germans during the war and then became a refugee and came over to Australia. His conflict resolution style was pointing at his belt and none of us spoke back, as you say, not just out of respect but out of fear. And, yeah, I think you raise a really good point. We all have our strengths and weaknesses and we all have our differences in communication style. And family conflict and family business is a really, really tricky area because there are all these different rules that are trying to work together at the same time. So you have a family business that's operating, but at the same time, in a broader context, you've got a family that are trying to be a family, and mixing those together is really difficult. Where are the boundaries? Where are the lines that you can and cannot cross? How do you bring those together in a respectful, harmonious way, but still be a family unit, which is sometimes disrespectful to a certain level.
Yeah, and it is hard in the sense that families generally don't let things go like you would with a business partner. You know, if you've got a business partner you're not related to, you're just in business together, generally when things go wrong or you do have a little bit of conflict or some argy-bargy, shall we say, people get over it and move on. That's just business. Whereas when it's family, people seem to, you know, grab hold of that with white knuckles and just wrestle it into the ground and just will never let go of that perceived or real hurt.
Plus, you have to see them all the time.
And at Christmas.
And at Christmas. But you don't see your business partners at Christmas necessarily. I mean, you might do. But yeah, you know, sometimes families and in particular your clients, they live quite closely together or closely in the context of how they're otherwise very apart from people. You know, people that are living in regional areas of Australia sometimes don't have close neighbours, but their family might be nearby, but they also work with their family. So you're bringing together these people in a work environment and a family environment.
So, Kate, mediation, what the hell is it and how does it work?
Mediation is really about having a structured, facilitated conversation. So in order to have a mediation, we bring people together and we create an agenda, if you will, of the things or the topics that are going to be discussed. And the purpose of having a mediator there is to actually facilitate that process, add structure to that process, and control some of the dynamics that can make difficult conversations fall apart really quickly. So the skill of a mediator isn't just in conflict resolution, it's actually in holding space for people to have really difficult conversations as well. And that can look different for all sorts of people. Some people can't even have those conversations in the same room as each other, and that's okay. You can find a way to have difficult conversations and actually advance through those issues with people developing a better understanding of the issue or the topic before they actually start to look to resolve issues. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that about mediators. My understanding is that people feel pretty shattered when they come to mediation. They feel like failures. We haven't been able to resolve this ourselves, and we should be able to resolve it ourselves. And going to a mediator feels like this really extreme step, that we've had to go and engage this mediator to sort us out. That's a negative thing. One of the first things I say to people is the reason why mediators exist is because having difficult conversations is really hard. It's really hard. And in a way, you should try and see it as a positive thing. You obviously value something about what you're doing here, that you're willing to invest some time and some effort and some money, quite honestly, because mediation, has a cost to it, of course, into resolving this issue. And that's a positive thing. The fact that you're even showing up for that conversation and putting that energy and that effort and that time and that money into that process is a really good starting position. And I think even just reframing that for people right from the beginning is a really positive, because it takes them away from that negative mindset of we have failed and we need a mediator to a positive mindset of, yes, let's get the most out of this that we can. Let's see how productive we can make this. And actually, mediation can be a really transformational process for people. It can provide them with an atmosphere to be a bit more vulnerable and a bit more genuine and a bit more honest, and actually get to the dynamic below the conflict, which actually has a better opportunity then of resolving things more long-term than just sorting out the side effect of conflict.
The symptom.
The symptom, yeah.
It's interesting, Kate. Before I met you, I thought a mediator was just someone that just before you went to court, you've been battling it out with two lawyers and we've been fighting and arguing over, a divorce, a business partnership splitting up, some sort of contractual dispute, and you get together with your two lawyers and your two clients, and then you have a mediation before you go to court. And
the last-ditch effort.
Yeah. And it's like, in some cases, are people forced into that? Is it a good idea? Is it not? But what I've come to realise that mediation is far more than that. It usually is far better to engage a mediator before you get to that point. Is that correct?
Yeah, I agree, definitely. In fact, sometimes people come to see me just too late, too far down the line, and relationships are so badly ruptured. And even then, it's still possible to have a good quality conversation. But of course, there's more lived experiences to unpack, more difficult negative emotions that have been created, more animosity, sometimes more harm that's been created from conflict, because conflict can be very harmful for people psychologically, financially, sometimes physically. And, the last-ditch effort is still a very common mentality, I think, to when you should use mediation. And I think lawyers sell people or their clients the product of mediation as a last-ditch effort, which is a real shame because it can actually be used much earlier on. And we try to educate people about that by encouraging them to think about mediation as a really good quality facilitated discussion. And a lot of people come to see us without lawyers really early on in disputes, and they see the benefit of that. Sometimes people come to see us early on and we actually refer them to lawyers for some advice about narrowed issues. Even that is time-saving, cost-saving, and keeps the conflict at a more workable level as opposed to blowing it out as a full-blown litigation.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode.
Which is going to cost far more money down the track. It's almost like a prevention is better than the cure. And the cure is we sit in court, we slug it out, and then the lawyers buy their new Bentley or their new Porsche.
Yeah, Tesla these days, I think, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the cost of litigation, people have really started to educate themselves about that. And they also watch the lived experiences of other people. You know, family law separation, for example, is unfortunately fairly common now in our generation. And all of us have heard stories of friends that have separated and the cost involved in litigation. I'm sure, you know, the person that you meet down the pub who talks about how they paid their lawyers $150,000 in legal fees and they didn't get the result that they were looking for. So mediation, you know, it might feel like a soft approach to people, or it might feel like a failing, you know, that we haven't been able to resolve it ourselves. But it can actually just be this really powerful tool that you use to just start a conversation and see if a resolution is possible, but not even just a resolution, just some peacemaking between people that are in conflict.
And I suppose, is there also a level of calling out or stopping the bad behaviour that happens when there's no witnesses in the room, shall I say?
You know, it's really interesting because we always do a pre-mediation session, which is called an intake session. And almost always in those sessions, people tell me about the other person because they're individual sessions. So I meet with each person individually, and I'll often hear about how the other person is really nasty or narcissistic or this or that. You know, these really intense emotions that are tied to how people perceive the other person, usually with this very, very strong lens that, you know, there's nothing redeemable in respect of the other party. And they always tie that then to this fear about what they're going to be like in a mediation process. I can't talk to that person, or I can't negotiate with that person, or I can't get them to compromise on anything. And in mediation, one of the first things you see is people behaving differently. Because, as you say, there's this external person, this neutral person in the room who's facilitating, and people do like to present themselves in the best possible way. So it does create an artificial, perhaps, environment of people behaving well right from the beginning. But that usually exits the room by around 2 p.m. And a little more of their conflict resolution style starts to become evident at that point. But the importance of having a mediator with a good skill set is that they don't let people break down to that point. You know, you have to have a mediator that encourages breaks, that, you know, really encourages people to talk genuinely and honestly, and also to bring up the difficult conversations right at the beginning of the day. When I first started off as a newbie mediator, I found it really tricky having the difficult conversations too, which was really interesting because I had a legal background.
So the difficult conversations with them in the room?
Yeah. You could feel that, you know, atmosphere of difficulty when there was a tricky conversation to be had. And I found myself naturally wanting to avoid that. And I thought, oh my God, I'm a mediator. I'm supposed to be addressing these issues and helping people talk about them. So I actually had to learn how to hold that space for people to have that, you know, really tricky stuff come up and be talked about at an early stage. And now I encourage people to do it because my lived experience is that if you allow that stuff to come up later on in the day when people are fatigued, or there's been all of this great work that's been done on stuff that doesn't matter as much, and then you bring up the bomb later on in the day, and then negotiations start to fray or rupture or break down, it's not helpful for anybody. So actually giving people the courage to bring up those difficult points earlier on is also part of the skill of a mediator rather than avoiding it.
Yeah, and I suppose too, most people want to be heard. So by being able to get their potential issues on the table and their grievances on the table early on, they feel like they've got all that off their chest, they've been heard, and then they're in a better place to be able to either negotiate or look at the situation from someone else's point of view.
Easier said than done, though. It's
much.
really hard to talk honestly with people. And, you know, in business or in commercial disputes, it could be easier if you don't have a close relationship. But if you have a family relationship, you don't want to upset people that you also love.
Or you want to upset them really well.
Or you want to upset them a lot.
Yeah, because you feel aggrieved.
Because you feel aggrieved.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. It's a difficult thing for people to do, to be genuine and honest.
So, Kate, the interesting thing is, in family business, the three areas I suppose I see is partnership breakdown. So you might have, say, brothers and sisters in partnership and they want to go their separate ways and they just can't work that out. Number 2 is a divorce in the family. Or number 3 is succession planning. You know, the next generation's wanting to take over from mum and dad. Mum and dad are wanting to move on and retire, but they just can't find a resolution. And those things become really, really problematic in families. And normally it's just this history of bad behaviour, bad decisions, not being heard, you know, conflict around the kitchen table, etc., that just pushes people to the point where they just explode. So how do you know, Kate, or what are the signs that you go from, okay, we can handle this ourselves and get it done, to, well, we need to get some help. We need to bring someone in to be able to help negotiate this?
I think the most obvious sign would be that you're actually not having the real conversation. And if you feel like the frustration is mounting because you're not able to talk about the real stuff, you need to probably make a very concerted effort at having a conversation about the real stuff and really setting about to do that with the person just one-on-one or with the right people, the relevant people, people with an interest, all in play. And so there are some things that you can try and do first before you go to mediation to do that well. But if that's failed, I think you then need to look for professional assistance. And that could be in the form of either some support for you as an individual or by reaching out to a mediator and asking a mediator to see if everyone can come together for a dedicated conversation about the issues. Leaving it for a long time is never a good idea because it can be difficult even to get people to come to the conversation a long way down the track, or things may have soured so badly that, you know, really the writing's on the wall at that point of time. But it can be really tricky. You know, I think about your clients and your listeners, Ben, and I think about people who would just be so resistant to the concept of mediation. Why would we need a mediator? I'm not going to see a mediator. What a waste of money. We can do this ourselves.
We don't want to tell someone else our problems.
We don't
confidentiality.
Yeah, all of our family stuff. This is a family issue. We can sort this out ourselves. And I actually really respect that mentality and understand it. And some education might be needed there about what mediation could do. Or it could be that you as the person that is looking for mediation could just get vulnerable in that moment and say, you know what, I'm not coping. I just want to let you know that I'm not coping and that I need help having this conversation with you. We've tried to have this conversation. It doesn't seem to be resolving. We don't seem to be doing well at it. I've heard that mediation can be this really supportive process that allows us all to think about things. Could we give that a go? And see if you can encourage a different mentality around mediation or invite the other person to do some reading about mediation, et cetera, et cetera. But I imagine that it could be really difficult to get people to mediation because, as you say, Ben, there's this widely held belief that mediation is like the last-ditch effort before litigation. And I think because of that mentality, the person being invited to mediation might think, does this mean you're going to litigate against me? Is that the next step?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'd never thought about that.
Is litigation the next step? And oh my God, is this where we've gotten to? And then the barriers go up straight away. That fear response of this has escalated beyond anything that I would have wanted it to. So it can be really tricky to help people see that mediation doesn't have to look like that. And it can just look like this really positive, facilitated discussion at an early stage to get everybody on the right track. But in terms of things that people could do, Really I would encourage people to take a 3-step approach to trying to resolve their own matters. The first step, which is sometimes the trickiest for people, is to do a little bit of self-examination. What have I been like in this conflict? And I'm laughing because I even think about myself in conflict. And, we all behave badly, don't we, Ben?
Absolutely.
When we're emotional or upset or aggrieved, as you say, by something that's happened and we feel like some of our values aren't being respected by other people or are being disrupted by the behaviour of other people, having that ability to look at how we've responded and pick on ourselves and give ourselves a bit of a boot up the backside to behave better can be a bit confronting. But I think that you need to do that honestly as a first step. Look at how you've communicated. Look at how you've behaved. Look at what you can acknowledge that you've potentially not done well. How can you be accountable for those things? But also examine what you're really after here. What is your goal? Sometimes people don't have a lot of clarity around that.
Do you want to win or be happy?
I love that you use that saying because I think about it a lot. It's a really good point. But people often don't have a lot of clarity about what they're trying to achieve. If it's a family business dispute, or I just want more responsibility. Okay, what does that look like? I don't know. I just want to be in charge. What does being in charge look like? I don't know. And really sitting with yourself and figuring out what does that plan look like? What is it that you are working towards? What are the various options available to that? And then step 2 is to think about the other person and get into their shoes, which is easier said than done because if we're upset or angry with the other person, we don't want to do that. We want to just hate them, or feel angry towards them. But to just jump into their shoes and try and live and breathe what the conflict or the dispute might look like or feel like from their perspective, and also examine what our communication might look like for them, what our behaviour might look like for them, what issues might they see as being relevant, what are their goals, what are their motivations, what might be their reasoning behind what they're doing or what they're saying. And then step 3 is once you've done that sort of self-examination and that exploration of the other person's perspective, to actually invite the relevant key people to a meeting, but the right kind of meeting. And I think this is probably where people don't do such a good job of their own conflict resolution, because you'll just launch into a discussion about an issue at the time that feels right for you.
Normally for most farmers and graziers, you speak to them and it's usually in the yards just after they've mustered or done branding or they've had a big heavy day doing something, and they'll go up to Dad. They'll say, "Hey Dad, we haven't talked about this succession planning yet. What the hell's going on?" And Dad stands there going, "What the hell? Where'd that come from?" And then lashes out.
Yeah.
Or it'll be like, "You're always a drongo. You never get things right in the cattle yards," and it all blows up. So seldom do people actually go down the path of having those conversations at the right times.
Yeah.
And what I've observed over the years, and this is why I'm such an advocate for family meetings, is then to go from, well, when do I ask? And you say, well, call a meeting. And then that becomes such a confronting thing for the family. My sons or daughter-in-law or daughters called a meeting and we've got to sit around and have this conversation. Well, what do they want to talk about? This is going to end up a dust-up. I don't know how to deal with this. And everyone just goes into complete meltdown about that as well. Whereas if you have regular family meetings and you practice these conversations on very small disagreements, then when you want to have a discussion about a larger one, you can make it an agenda item. You can have a proper conversation and then it becomes so much easier.
That's really solid advice, and not even just smaller conflicts, but even positive things. Discussing positive things so those meetings aren't necessarily just attached to a negative experience of only talking about negative stuff or things that aren't working well. Having a dedicated meeting is a really important thing to do, but making sure that that meeting is the right kind of meeting is the key component.
What's the right kind?
The right kind needs to be mutually agreeable. So everyone needs to have a say about what that meeting even looks like. When are we doing it? The date, the time, the place. How are we having the meeting? Who's going to be there? Is it around Dad's dining room table? Is it around...
Which is a big, big no-no, isn't it?
Is it around Simon's dining room table? Is it around Farmer Jeff's table down the road because he's sort of like the uncle figure that everyone adores, and he makes a nice cup of tea and his wife makes a good scone. Where is the right place? It's certainly probably not, as you say, after Dad's finished a really, long 14-hour day of fencing. He's shattered, he's fatigued. He wants to go home, he wants to eat, he wants to shower, he wants to lie down and have a rest. His back is sore, He's been in the sun all day. He's dehydrated. You have to find the right time. It needs to be really well considered, and everyone needs to have a say in that. And even that can be tricky. Sometimes in organising mediations, we spend multiple hours just discussing what the process will look like with people. And conflict can even occur at that stage. I want a mediation in person. No, I want it to be a Zoom mediation. I want Francis to be there. No, Francis absolutely can't be there because Francis really upsets me. Everyone needs to have a say in who's there and what it all looks like.
One of the things we quite often see in families is that we exclude some family members, and the obvious one is the daughter-in-law. We'll see that all the time.
Meghan Markle.
Yeah, so we will exclude her. We'll have the conversation without her. My experience has been is if you are a family business, everyone should be involved because eventually your son or your daughter will go home to their partner and then they'll have the conversation and then it'll be he said, she said, you should have said, etc., whereas everyone should be in the room. Do you believe everyone that's got a stake in the business should be in the room, Kate?
Potentially is the answer. Isn't that so typical of a lawyer? Potentially, maybe. But maybe we can assign different roles to people who are attending. I think, as you say, if some key people aren't there, any agreement that's reached in the room might not get off the ground because they go home to their own environment, and all of the other people who have a say, a hidden say, are other stakeholders but weren't in the room or in part of the conversation, don't understand the compromises that were made or the agreements that were made or the negotiated position. And they could flip that whole deal over really, really quickly because there's this other contract, which is husband and wife contract or other business partner, relationships, etc. So as you say, you have to look at the wider perspective on who the stakeholders are, but you can assign different roles to people. So in mediation, we often have parties. So those are the key stakeholders in a dispute or in a difficult, moment, having a difficult interaction, a moment of conflict. Then we have people who come along as their supports. Now, support people are given a different responsibility in mediation. So they're really there as an emotional support. But during private sessions where parties and support people meet with mediators, we often hear from support people about the things that they want to add to the conversation. But as you say, it's really helpful to have them there because they then see the work that's being done by the key stakeholders in having the conversations, in making the concessions, in compromising, in negotiating, in reaching a settled position. And they have more buy-in and they support the outcome potentially more. Even if they shouldn't have a direct, key, loud voice, they've still been there to witness the process and be part of it. And they can feel like they've been involved.
It's interesting. When I had my financial advice business, I flatly refused to give advice to a family unless all the parties were there. So if it was husband and wife, if the wife didn't turn up or the husband wasn't engaged, I wouldn't do it because what would happen is you'd go through the whole process of digging through, working out goals and objectives, talking about risk and return, and then coming up with the strategy. They'd then go home. Someone who hadn't been on that journey would look at it and go, well, why the bloody hell are you doing that? That doesn't make any sense. And it would just derail the whole system. And it would be far more work for me. And 90% of the time, people just wouldn't engage in it totally. So I used to make sure stakeholders were always in the room. And I think if you've got a family and you've got a family business and you want it to thrive into the future, you've got to find a way to make that work. It's really important, I believe. Now, there'll be certain scenarios where that may not work. I totally get that and everyone has to make their decisions. But I'd be aiming to try and have everyone in the room, everyone having the conversations, because if you don't have that conversation now with that person, you're going to have it later. Like you're just delaying it because what is it? A disagreement avoided or covered up is a disagreement magnified. And if you've got someone not in the room that is, as you clearly said, a stakeholder, a husband, a wife, an adult child, etc., is a stakeholder in the situation, without a doubt.
For some people, they can't be there though.
Appreciate that. No, I definitely appreciate that. And they might not want to be there. They might not, but you would have to say that ideally, with some exceptions, that's where you'd want to be.
Yeah, another option is to have sunset clauses on agreements. Sometimes people are just so hasty to try and reach an outcome, a settled outcome straight away, and to sign the dotted line on what that looks like.
Get the hell out of that room.
Get the hell out of it. Avoid conflict, avoid. But sunset clauses can be really great because it lets people sit with that compromised, settled agreement for a period of time to float that in their environment away from the pressure of a conversation, which can feel pressured for a lot of people, even if there's no actual pressure being put on them. That might be their own pressure that they're feeling, to resolve it. And then to go home to their own environment and, float that with their other supports, etc., sit with it for a while. And then if they agree to it still at that point, that's a really solid agreement. They've gone home and they've really sat with it,
One of the things that I talk about with my clients all the time is the 3 answers you get. There's the no, Ben, I disagree with that. There's the yes, absolutely, Ben, I definitely agree with that. And the third one is the yes, which is a counterfeit yes. So it's like, I'm just saying yes to shut you up. And I get that from my wife all the time. We have disagreements, you know Sarah quite well. But when we have those disagreements about something, and quite often she'll just say yes just to shut me up. And then later on I'm like, but you agreed to that. She goes, wow. Yeah,
does she say yes or does she say
probably a combination of both. But I think that's a real problem for people. And I see that time and time again with families is you'll get them in a room, you'll have that conversation and they'll just say yes. Let's just move on. We all agree to that. And then, you find out later on that it was just all fake. And so you've got to be super careful of the counterfeit yes.
What a waste of time. The counterfeit yes is an evil little being, isn't it? Because it feels like you've reached an outcome, but you haven't really. It's artificial. It's not going to last. And then it just builds more resentment because the other person or people think that you've figured it all out. And they're behind the outcome that was reached and they're doing all of the things that they said they would do. And then they're not seeing the behaviour or the agreement being played out from the other side. That would just create more animosity, more resentment. And then it would also make them more unwilling to come back to a mediation process again or to try and reach a resolution. It just creates this stronger narrative for them that you're an untrustworthy person.
Well, they also become a victim because they say, I feel like I was bullied into this decision. So I'm guessing that's a really important point is if you do mediate within your family or try and have these discussions, you're not going to resolve it in one meeting, are you?
Oh, no. A lot of the family business mediations that I've had, because often there's more than 2 parties, we've had to create a series of meetings to try and address a series of issues. And inevitably people do come to mediation quite late often in those scenarios. So there's years of stuff to try and canvass. And even if you set an agenda for, these are the big headline issues, inevitably all of those strong emotions and lived experiences are coming up throughout the day. People need breaks during those conversations. And having one session alone is never going to be enough, potentially. Yeah. Yeah,
one of the things that I find really interesting, Kate, is I use the analogy of trying to get a cantankerous old bull up the race. And we always talk about when you're trying to have these conversations when there is conflict around partnerships, succession planning, retirement planning, those sorts of things, is you can't just run into the yards, throwing your hands in the air, yelling and screaming, because what's going to happen is that old bull's never going to go up the race. He's going to turn around, knock you over, jump over the fence and cause chaos. You got to use pressure and release. So you got to take them on the journey and then give it a little bit of pressure off, put a little bit more pressure. And then eventually, once they feel comfortable enough, they'll run up the race and then everyone's happy. But most people go in flapping their arms around, yelling and screaming and trying to get a resolution straight away, which is just not going to work for anyone. So, Kate, if we can just circle back, we said step 1 was all agree, because I think you said there was 3 steps.
Oh, so this is in the 3rd step, the right kind of meeting.
Yep.
Yeah. So the right kind of meeting, you've got the right, mutually agreed meeting place.
Yep.
Then you need to figure out what information needs to be shared before the meeting. Because I think some people are hesitant to come to that meeting because they don't know what they're going to be listening to. They're going to feel like they're being ambushed by things. So if you could circulate even, dot point of the types of issues that you want to talk about. Now, Warning, when you're writing things down, make sure that you use language that can feel inclusive for the other person. If, for example, you and I were going to a meeting, Ben, and I wrote,
discussing your bad behaviour, Ben.
Discussing, your bad behaviour, you're going to say, thanks so much for the bullet points, Kate. I won't be attending that meeting, which would be fair enough. But if I wrote down something that was a little more inclusive or neutral and said, discussing appropriate workplace behaviour. I mean, you're probably going to have your guard up a little bit anyway because you're going to think, am I part of the problem here? Maybe I am because I'm included in the meeting, but okay, it's not targeting me. I don't feel defensive or reactive straight away. So using really neutral language, but circulating any information. So I don't know, if it's about how you want to expand the family business and you've found this really great product that you want to start growing on the farm, you want to move from, rocket to rocket and baby spinach that you're growing instead of just rocket, which you've always specialised in.
Or you want to take on some more debt.
Or you want to take on some more debt. Send the information before the meeting so people can read it and understand it in their own time, in their own way. If you just bombard people with information on the day, they're going to feel under pressure or they're going to want to read that and consider it before they start to talk about it or hear more from you. They're not going to be ready to be part of that conversation. So circulate information. And then the other thing I would encourage people to do is when you get to the meeting, do less talking and more listening. And, our children are often taught at school this really easy, analogy, which is 2 ears, 1 mouth. 2 ears, more listening, 1 mouth, less talking. And also just see if you can break that cycle of reacting in an aggressive fashion or responding with some sort of defensive mode or attacking another person. Instead, just come at everything from an active listening point of view. If you're feeling like your own emotional state is heightening, that's a cue to shut up for a second and just listen to the other person. Because if they're saying stuff that's challenging you, you need to understand that more. And it can feel very uncomfortable and very unnatural. And you might want to get up and walk away. But just sitting with that and listening to the other person for as long as possible and just shutting up for a moment can be really key.
That's being curious, isn't it?
Being curious, really trying to understand not only the message, but how they're feeling. And if they're talking in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable, it's obviously the case that they're upset about something. Why are they upset? See if you can get to the bottom of that. Ask them more questions. Can you help me understand your perspective more? Can you explain to me more about how it is that you arrived at that point? What is it that's so important to you about that? Get to the detail. Give them the platform to explain it as much as possible. And then I would really encourage people to have breaks. And breaks are something that people don't do, especially Australians, I've noticed. We have this tendency to just keep going. And I tell people all the time in mediation, if we have 100 breaks today, that's really great. That's a really great use of time. And people have this odd look on their face when I say that because they think, isn't that a waste of time? Aren't we supposed to be in here getting the work done?
Well, that's the pressure release, isn't it? It's like the pressure on, the pressure off, the pressure on, pressure off, and then the animal doesn't jump out over the fence.
Yes, exactly. It's unnatural to sit in a room for 8 hours just hashing out really complex issues, being genuine and honest and vulnerable for that long, or talking about things that upset you. It's not possible for people. Take a 1-minute breather. I call them balcony moments. Just go out onto the balcony, breathe in, breathe out, look at the horizon, look at a tree, look at a bird, hear a bird.
Break your state
and move your body around and then come back in and start the conversation again. It can be as simple as just saying, I'm just going to go and get us some more water, or I'm going to go make a cup of tea, or would anyone like a scone, just to break up that meeting a little bit. But that can be hard to bring people back to the table if somebody then exits, And again, this is why mediators are so useful and skilled, because they can actually tell people to have breaks or schedule breaks or notice when somebody's not engaging in the conversation anymore. It's more than just actually facilitating the discussion. It's about noticing how people are and noticing when people are not okay and helping people actually participate appropriately.
It's interesting, Kate. I remember I had a client many years ago who was an amazing construction project manager, and he used to deal with building high rises. So he was in his late 20s and he was project managing these 50, 60 story high rises, which is unheard of for his age. And he was just really good at it. And I remember him said to me one day, I said, how do you deal with all the trades? And, these are heavy blue-collar workers. They fly off the handle, especially concreters. If you've ever met many concreters, they've usually got a short fuse. And he just said, I have the philosophy in life that he's a bloke, he said, he who loses his cool first loses the argument. And I've said that so many times to families. If you lose your cool, it's game over. You've instantly lost. Now, I'm not saying you've lost the game. It's just you're not going to achieve what you wanted to achieve. There's no way. And so you've got to try your hardest just to make sure you just don't lose that cool. And if breaks, so that's what it is. If it's taking a pause, if it's being curious. Because I know for me, Kate, if I'm cranky about something, if I just become a little bit more curious and change the narrative in my head and say, okay, well, Kate just said something that really upset me. I'm pretty pissed off right now. What else could that mean? Or even ask Kate, you said XYZ. What do you mean by that? Help me understand. Ben. You never upset me, Kate. And so it's trying to tone it down so you don't lose your cool, because there's history. I mean, a lot of families that get to that point, they either shut down and say nothing or they blow up.
Yeah, that artificiality of everything's okay because we're just pretending it's not okay. Yeah. Well, pretending it is okay.
Yeah, and that's probably harder. I actually find in my experience over time is the ones that shut down are the hardest, because at least the ones that blow up, they've got a short fuse, they let it all out, and if you let them go, they'll burn it out and then they'll come back to the table. It's the ones that go quiet, trying to get them out of their shell is awfully difficult to do.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is we're all humans and those generational differences are real, as we spoke about at the beginning today. Sometimes it's not possible to change how conflict resolution happens for other people. It could be that going through this process of thinking about conflict that we're experiencing is actually just for ourselves, and it changes how we interact in conflict resolution. So the purpose is not to try and change how Dad communicates with us, because that probably won't happen, but we can change how we are in those conversations. And we can also try and model, even for older generations, conflict resolution in a different way.
If you ask yourself, what do you want to achieve out of this? Yeah. And then you become more curious about those persons and you become flexible in that style, that communication, you're going to have a far greater chance of actually getting the resolution you're looking for.
Yeah. And, if at that first step you think, what is it that I want? And you realise, I actually just don't want to have this relationship anymore, then the writing's on the wall too, But more often than not, that isn't the case. There's usually a relationship or a connection that we want to continue or that needs to continue. And it's a moment of reflection that we need to scale issues. We need to check our priorities. We need to examine our values and our own interests. And we need to put things in perspective. And conflict is really interesting because sometimes conflict is actually just our own perception, our own narrative of what's occurring, and we can cool ourselves down or help ourselves get a different perspective on conflict. And if you go through that exercise, it can be quite comforting and reassuring, and validating, because you might say to yourself, this is really hard, this is really tricky, I do feel really hurt, but, I love my dad, I want to try and make this work with Dad. I also really respect him as a businessman, and I respect, his decision making. And I know that I'm really lucky to be part of this generational business, and I want to be part of it. And maybe my desires and my needs and my interests just need to be scaled at this point of time. Maybe I need to do a better job of communicating about what I'm feeling. Maybe I need to find the right time to talk with Dad about how I'm feeling really hurt because I'm not feeling included in the way that I want to be. And if I can be genuine and honest and real with him about that, he might see that I'm not just being greedy or pushy, that there's this other aspect of what's happening. Have I told Dad that I'm not coping? Have I told Dad that every night I'm going home and I'm miserable and I'm drinking more than I usually do, and I'm upset with my wife and my kids because I'm feeling frustrated that I'm not achieving what I thought I would be achieving at this point of time in my life? Just exploring for ourselves what we're going through first, being really genuine and honest. And that can be hard and it can be emotional, and people might need some professional support at that point of time. But the goal is not to then change how the other person behaves because you'll lose that battle. Don't come at it in that way. It's about what you can do, what you can be accountable for, and then thinking about their perspective as well. Then finding the right kind of meeting and coming to that meeting with more focus about what it is that you need to discuss, what you need to share information about, how you can articulate your perspective to the other person so that they can hear that. And look, if all of that fails, then try mediation and think about it in a positive way, not a negative way.
It's interesting. I believe in the secret to success is who, not how, for most scenarios. Unfortunately, for most farmers and graziers, they're what they call rugged individualists. So when I was brought up, there was no money. So you had to be the jack of all trades. If the tractor broke, you had to be the mechanic. If there was something wrong with the animals, you had to be the vet.
An amazing quality.
Yeah, it is. It's a beautiful quality. But there comes a point where you don't have all the solutions. And the cheaper option, both in family relationships, money and time, is to get someone to do that for you. And I remember a great example many years ago was a mate of mine, his dad had bought some tractor tyres and he was one of these real rugged individualists, and he had them sitting in the shed for 12 months and finally decided he needed to change this tractor tyre. It took him 2 days to change his tractor tyre. And he finally got that tractor tyre on and he was really proud and he's like, yep, I got that bugger. I finally got that tyre on. He could have paid someone to come out and fit that tractor tyre in half an hour. And yet he took 2 days. And I think when it comes to these family issues, they're far more difficult than a tractor tyre. And if you could bring someone in to be able to go, okay, let's have these conversations. And sometimes if you do it either early on or you get past a certain point, then you can possibly go off and do that yourself afterwards.
Yeah.
You've built enough skills.
That's right. Mediation can also be learning a skill set and seeing what it can look like to have a focused, structured conversation with some ground rules in place, with some focus, and to learn how to do that and feel what that looks like as opposed to other conversations that are unstructured or not facilitated.
Yeah. Excellent, Kate. Well, that's been fantastic. We could have another couple of episodes on this, but we're running out of time now. Just for everyone listening, you won't have heard it, but I think about 5 minutes ago, I looked at the clock and said to Kate, holy shit, we've been going for 3/4 of an hour and we both thought it was only about 15 minutes. So, Kate, obviously mediators, I know and I've seen them operate, can add a huge amount of value, but is there any piece of advice you want to give us before we sort of wind up and sign off, before I ask the last little question?
Any piece of advice? Pause and be patient. I think we're all in a rush. And sometimes if you just sit back and feel the back of your chair and let something sit with you for a little bit longer, it can create some new perspective or new understanding. And we all seem to want to rush through things all the time. But yeah, just leaning back, feel the back of your chair, listening to people, really listening and not talking, and also quietening your mind, because even if we're not talking, we're sometimes still thinking at 1,000 miles an hour.
Thinking with the idea of responding rather than listening.
Just really, really listening to people and trying to understand or even visualize what they're talking about if you're a visual person, and really get to understand what other people's perspective on an issue is before you start to respond to it.
Perfect. I think that's great advice, Kate. Now, Kate, Clark & Associates Mediation Services, tell us quickly about the business and then we'll move on to the last most exciting question.
Clark & Associates, we started in 2017. We're a law firm, but we only offer mediation services in some key areas. So we can help with business disputes, partnership disputes, contract disputes, family disputes, family separation. We also do some other quirky work called restorative justice mediation, which might not be that relevant to some of your listeners, but it's some really amazing work that we do. And our focus really is on getting to know people. So before we have a mediation, we meet with each individual person and really understand their perspective, which is a big difference to some other mediation services that exist, where everybody just meets the mediator on the day of mediation. So I get to really know people, build rapport and trust with people before we have a mediation, which feels very different. Our clients tell us that feels very supportive for them. So that's our point of difference.
Where can they find you online, Kate?
At our website, which is www.clarkmediation.com.au, not Clark Meditation, don't really specialize in meditation. And we have an Instagram page, which is called @Respectful Resolutions. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Kate Clark with no E.
Excellent. Last question. I know you've been thinking about this a lot for the last hour in the back of your mind. If you could go back in a time machine, Kate, and have a deep and meaningful with 30-year-old Kate, what would you tell the young lass?
Well, we had lots of jokes about things that I would tell myself before. Look, I think I'm still telling myself this. I think I'm still telling myself just to take my time and just enjoy each phase and moment of life and not be in a rush to do things and get to the next stage, just to sit with each experience.
Beautiful advice. I love it. Bulletigate Benny has never slowed down for anything, as you probably know. Well, Kate, that's been fabulous. I've written a whole lot of notes, as I always do. Thanks very much for coming on. And I reckon there is a podcast take 2 in our future.
No,
what do you reckon?
Everyone's sick of listening to us already, I'm sure.
I'm sure they aren't. I'm sure they aren't. Fantastic, Kate. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ben.
That's one of the great things about podcasting is you get to learn so much from your guests when you get quality guests, and Kate's one of those. She knows her stuff and she's passionate and she really cares about people. So I've got a whole lot of information here to be able to take away and use myself. As mentioned in the podcast, Kate's put together a bit of a resource for everyone. It's what we call a DIY, do-it-yourself cheat sheet on how to do or at least attempt your own family mediation, to at least give you the tools and the opportunity to go away and try to do a little bit of this yourself. So if you go to www.thefinancialbloke.com.au/DIY, so it's D for do, I for it, Y for you, so DIY mediation. And you should be able to download that. If you've got any problems, send me an email, ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Now, if you enjoyed the podcast, or if you know a family that might happen to want to, need a bit of help and they're having a bit of a struggle, please send on the podcast. It's amazing how much feedback we get from people saying, one of my friends shared the podcast with me and we're so glad we got some information out of that podcast. We needed it just at the right time. So thank you very much for everyone who's doing that. We really sincerely appreciate it. Now, that's it for today. We'll see you next time.